Hi, this is Dr. P, and I'm going to dip into history again today for our topic of interrupted wars. Now, this is not something I can remember thinking about before, even though it's fairly important and can be fairly important in contexts of game design, especially for RPGs. These are wars that stop for one or more years or even a generation and then continue, sometimes to a conclusion, sometimes not. It includes what I'll call perpetual wars, such as England versus France or Russia versus Ottoman Empire or Athens versus Sparta. But more immediate consideration are the wars interrupted by an interval of peace, whether days or a few years, and then concluded. An example is Napoleon versus the world. Of course, this was a continuation of the wars of the French Revolution beginning in 1789. Napoleon had become the elected leader and was in charge, but he was not yet emperor when the Treaty of Amiens was concluded in 1802. That treaty ended the war for less than a year. Not all provisions of the treaty were even implemented before Britain declared war again, and that war lasted another 13 years. Ending in 1814, Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba, but within a year or so he came back and was welcomed by France and started an extension of the war that ended with Waterloo. And contrary to what some people may tell you, if Napoleon had won Waterloo, the war would have continued. The Allies had ground him down in 1813 and 14, and they would have done it again in 1815 or 16, however long it would take. And that concluded the war. Another example is Athens versus Sparta. Before the famous Second Peloponnesian War, there was a First Peloponnesian War, and even that war saw a 5-year truce. The Second Peloponnesian War from 431 BCE to 404 itself paused between 421 BCE and 413 BCE. And even after Sparta won the main war, they lost control of Athens not long after, and Athens rebuilt their long walls, and the long conflict continued. And this series of wars devastated Greece. Ultimately, Macedonia conquered Greece. Even earlier, we have the Persians versus the Greeks. The Persian invasion starting in 490 BCE and onward were followed by a long war. And ultimately a peace was agreed. And after a decades-long interval of peace, Persia bankrolled Sparta to defeat Athens in the Peloponnesian War. After another 80 or so years, Alexander the Great invaded and destroyed the Persian Empire, and that was the end of Persia versus Greece because Persia no longer existed. Now these intervals were generations long, so this is an extreme case. Usually the interval in an interrupted war is some years, not decades. The Hundred Years' War was a series of wars between England and France over who would control the French crown, whether in fact the English king would also become the French king. This is the era of the Black Prince, of English, who were mostly Welsh, longbowmen, and Joan of Arc. England won many famous battles. They even captured the French king at one time, but they lost in the end. And finally, the French controlled the kingship in all of France except Calais. Although the rivalry between England and France did continue, although there were times when France was an ally of England. World War I and World War II are seen by some as two parts of the same war. The United Kingdom, France, and Russia versus Germany, ultimately including the USA on the Allied side. In 1940-41, Japan and Italy switched sides to Germany. And of course in 43, Italy switched back to the Allies. Turkey remained neutral in World War II, where the Ottomans were on the German side in World War I and were destroyed. Austria-Hungary was gone, but Hungary and Romania were on the German side, and Austria and Czechoslovakia had been annexed by Germany. In contemporary times, the Arab-Israeli conflict is an example of an interrupted and not yet concluded war. While the Arab countries have abandoned designs to destroy Israel, which was the reason for the war in the first place, the Palestinians have not. And as long as the Palestinians are taught to hate the Israelis, there will be further occasions of the war. Now, the Korean War may end up being an example of an interrupted war. The interruption has lasted since 1953, but there is not even a peace treaty, just an armistice. And that brings up the question, what's an armistice? Aside from Korea, the fighting in World War I ended with an armistice. It amounts to the same thing as a ceasefire or a truce. For example, the definition, quote, an agreement made by opposing sides in a war to stop fighting for a certain time, a truce, end of quote. Perhaps there's an implication that an armistice will last a long time while a truce isn't likely to. Unfortunately, I don't know when the ceasefires in 1918 and 1953 began to be called armistices. Were they called that from the get-go or not? I don't know. So we can look at this in a general way. Some wars end in one continuous go, what people tend to think of as normal wars. Some are interrupted once or twice. Some are interrupted many times but may still reach a conclusion. Some are perpetual, fought again and again without a conclusion. Normal wars may be the most common, but there's lots of other possibilities. Now, if you're designing an historical game, you ought to understand that interrupted wars are not unusual. If you're creating a fantasy or science fiction game, or even a world for playing RPGs, interrupted war becomes part of your toolbox of choices, often a motivation in favor of further war. Sometimes a story can resolve entirely around the continuation of or the desire to continue a past war. Now that brings up the war that's going on today. Will Russia's invasion of Ukraine become an interval in interrupted war? Well, in fact, it's already an interrupted war. A ceasefire or treaty cannot resolve the fundamental intent by Russia to eradicate Ukraine, and we've seen that from the past now broken treaties. There have been interruptions. Did the war start in 2022? Did it start in 2014? Did it start earlier? A ceasefire today is a fool's errand. They really need to fight until one of them is totally exhausted. And that might conclude the war. Thanks for listening.